and we are talking about the internal structure of verb phrases. So we're thinking about how we can provide tree diagrams of all of the information that we have been talking about so far. The assignment for this material is the verb phrase structures, and that assignment is not due until Sunday at 11:59. So you have until Sunday. It says originally on the syllabus that it was due last weekend. It's not due last weekend. It's not due until Sunday. But first, remember, make sure you go through everything about the verb phrase types, the readings, the lectures that I had given earlier, all of the exercises, get really comfortable with that, and then go to the verb phrase structures. So we saw that we have verb phrase structures which can be monotransitive, which can be ditransitive, ditransitive, which can be intransitive. And what else do we have as a possibility in English? We have a few more possibilities. So, for example, if you have a sentence like, John is in South Dakota, what is going on in this sentence? At the most basic level, any sentence is comprised of the subject and the predicate. So you have John as your subject here, is in South Dakota is therefore the predicate of the sentence. This is what is giving you information about the subject of the sentence. It's telling you what information is being provided about this topic, John. So in South Dakota is your predicate, and since the only verb that we have in this whole sentence is the verb is, it must be the case that this verb is our main verb. In other words, it is the verb of the sentence. Within the verb group, you're only going to have just that verb is. So looking then at what follows the verb in South Dakota, so what's happening with in South Dakota? It's modifying John. It's giving you information about where is John. So for that reason, we call this a subject complement, and we sometimes abbreviate this as SC. And remember that a subject complement can be many different types of phrases. It can be a noun phrase, it can be an adjective phrase, it can be a prepositional phrase. But what is important is that the subject complement is always giving you information about the subject of the sentence. So when you say John is in South Dakota is telling you information about John, right? It's not telling you information about the verb is, because is not somehow in South Dakota, it's the location of John. So for that reason, in South Dakota is seen as a subject complement, and it's comprised of a prepositional phrase. Why? Because we have in as our preposition and South Dakota as the noun phrase following that preposition. Remember that whenever we have a prepositional phrase, we're going to expect to see preposition, noun phrase. Those are the two units that always appear when you have a prepositional phrase. So what about when you have something other than a prepositional phrase that is serving as a subject complement? Let's look at an example like that. So, for example, if you have John is very angry. Let's take that sentence. John is very angry. What is going on with this example? It's still fundamentally the same semantically as the previous example. When you say John is in South Dakota, you're describing a property of John. You're describing his location. But when you say John is very angry, you're still doing the same thing. You're saying something about John, in other words, that he has the property of being very angry. So very angry is still functioning as a subject complement here, even though it's not a prepositional phrase. How do you know that this is not a prepositional phrase? Well, there's no preposition here. What do we have here? Very is an adverb, and angry is an adjective. Very is telling you about the intensity of anger. So very is an adverb because it's modifying an adjective. It's modifying something other than a noun. So therefore, we know it's an adverb. And since very is modifying angry, this whole phrase is going to be an adjective phrase. In other words, the item that gets modified determines the type of phrase that you have. So for example, this will be adjective phrase. And And this will be the complete structure that you have for the predicate when you have an intensive example where you have an adjective phrase serving as the subject complement. However, remember we can have another possible structure because you can have a prepositional phrase, an adjective phrase, or or a noun phrase in that position, serving as the subject complement. So, prepositional phrase, adjective phrase, noun phrase. They all have the same basic structure, but you have to pay attention in your tree diagram to what type of phrase you have here. So if you have a sentence like, John is the boss. John is the boss. Think about what the meaning of the boss is here. Is it the case that the boss is the direct object of the verb be? If it were, then we would expect that the boss would be receiving the action of being. However, when you kind of think about that, and you think about what does that mean, is it the case that the boss is the recipient of the action of being? That doesn't seem to describe the meaning of this sentence. And when we think about it, John is the boss is necessarily referring back to John. Therefore, the boss is another example of a subject complement. It's telling you information about the subject of the sentence. So, the boss, obviously, structurally, is not an adjective phrase. We have no adjectives here. We have a determiner and we have a noun. Those two are going to come together to form a noun phrase. So we're going to turn this guy, this adjective phrase, into a noun phrase. But everything else about the structure of this example is exactly the same. Everything is exactly the same. Why? Because it is of the same type. So every type of verb phrase has the same basic structure. And the most important thing in analyzing the structure of predicates, the structure of verb phrases, is to be very clear about what is going on in terms of what is the direct object, what is the indirect object, what is the subject complement. If you're clear about all of those notions, then providing the structure for the verb phrase is just automatic. All you have to do is identify the type of phrase that you have. You already know what the structure is going to look like. Okay, so we've talked about monotransitives, ditransitives, intransitives, intensives. What if we have something like the verb glance? So remember that we have a few verbs in English that are interesting because they don't seem to be able to take a direct object. So when you say Mary glanced, right, you can't continue with Mary glanced the book. Although you might think, well, that would make sense because it would mean something like Mary glanced through the book. But we can't say it that way in English. We have to say Mary glanced through the book, or Mary glanced into the book, or Mary glanced some sort of preposition, the book, right? We need some sort of preposition there because we have the verb glance. So, Mary glanced through the book. Our subject is going to be Mary. That's who the sentence is about. So we're going to divide first and get rid of our subject. And after we finish talking about the internal structure of the verb phrase, we're going to come back and talk about putting together the subject and the predicate in terms of the sentence structure. So here we have our next constituent, which is necessarily the verb group, comprised here only of the verb glanced. Why? Because glanced is the only verb in this sentence. You have the sentence, Mary glanced through the book. The only verb that you have there, how do you know? You have a past tense marker. Nothing else in this sentence can appear with a past tense marker. You can say Mary glanced through the book. Or Mary glanced through the book, right? The past tense marker can always only appear on the verb. So this is our main verb. It's therefore our verb group. And what comes after this? Through the book. Remember that when we have a verb group followed by a prepositional phrase, we could have an intensive verb group. Because if you say, John is in the room is describing John. It's a subject complement, therefore it's intensive. But think about through the book here. Is it the case that through the book modifies Mary? Is Mary being described as through the book somehow? No, that doesn't make sense semantically. So really what's going on is that it's the glancing event that is taking place through the book. And we have here, thus, a preposition through followed by its noun phrase, the book. So in other words, a prepositional phrase. Therefore, we have a prepositional complement. And you can abbreviate this as PC if you want. You can put PC as this item. Thus, what type of verb phrase do we have? A prepositional verb phrase. It is one comprised of a verb group plus an obligatory prepositional phrase. An obligatory prepositional phrase. Why is obligatory important? You could have said, Mary glanced through the book on Monday in her room without any reason, right? Notice you can add on to the end of the sentence many, many, many modifiers. You can add prepositional phrases on and on and on. You can add them on all day long if you want to. So all of those guys are different from through the book in the sense that they are not obligatory. You don't have to have them in the sentence. So when we say, Mary glanced through the book on Monday, it's just as fine to have the sentence, Mary glanced through the book, no on Monday. So whenever you can leave out a phrase from the sentence, what do you know? You know it's a modifier, it's optional, you're going to leave it out for this analysis. And we will talk about how it is that we fit into the structure, what we're going to call the adjuncts, the modifiers of the sentence. But for now, whenever we see a modifier, anything optional, completely leave it out. You can just X right through it and forget about it. So in other words, this verb phrase is comprised of only these two parts, the verb group, glance, and the prepositional phrase complement through the book. What is another example of a verb that takes a prepositional complement? Because remember, in English, we don't have too many of these verbs, right? So if you take a look at that section in your book that talks about prepositional complements, you have verbs like the child went into the room. So the child went into the room. We know that here our subject is going to be the complete subject is the child. That is all and only the subject of our sentence. So we're going to identify this and focus in on what's happening within the predicate of the sentence. Went into the room. We know that's going to be divided up into two parts, the verb group plus all the complements of the verb. And went is the only verb in this sentence, therefore it must be the whole verb group. And then we have this into the room. Well, what's going on here? We know that into is a preposition, and we know that the room is a noun phrase. So together these must form a prepositional phrase, but what type of prepositional phrase are they forming? The child went into the room. Could you have said the child went to the room? That would have been really weird, right? That's not a possible sentence in English. Why? Because the verb went in English is like the verb glance. It requires a prepositional phrase to follow it. In other words, it's a prepositional verb. So into the room is going to form a prepositional phrase. And then together, these two guys, the verb group and the prepositional complement, form the whole verb phrase. So whenever you have a prepositional verb phrase, what are you going to have? A verb group made up of main verb and any auxiliary verbs that you happen to have, followed immediately by an obligatory prepositional phrase. What is a prepositional phrase? It's consisting of a preposition plus a noun phrase. So whenever you see the sequence preposition, noun phrase, you want to ask yourself, is this a prepositional complement? Is this something that is describing the subject and the subject complement? Or is it just extra information that I didn't have to include? So for example, you could say, Mary fainted at the hospital. Fainted, we think of as being an intransitive verb because you can have the sentence, Mary fainted. You don't have to include in the hospital. When you do include in the hospital, you're getting extra information about where this event took place. So in the hospital is going to be a modifier. We're going to leave it out in terms of the syntactic analysis right now. And later on we'll talk about where we fit in elements that are modifiers. But for now, in order to determine the structure of the verb phrase, we leave out any sort of modifier. So when you have Mary fainted in the hospital, Mary fainted is going to be the only part of the sentence that you're concerned with. You're going to leave out completely in the hospital. But you're not going to leave out into the room. Why? Because you need it. If you said the child went, right, it's incomplete without the meaning of, well, where did the child go? You require the into the room, that directional expression, to complete the meaning of the predicate. So here you have a couple of examples of the prepositional verb phrase type. And recall that we have as well, less commonly, another type of verb phrase which is comprised of a verb group plus the direct object plus an object complement. What is the object complement? That is something that modifies the direct object. So it's just like a subject complement, except that it's modifying the object instead of the subject of the sentence. But it's playing exactly the same role. So therefore we expect that structurally it's going to be very similar to a subject complement. So for example, if you have the teachers in the other room voted Mary president. Let's look at this example and let's think about this a little bit more complex than our other examples, because what is our subject here? Our subject is something comprised of more than a single word. It's the teachers in the other room. How do we know that? Because what is this sentence about? Or who is this sentence about? It's about the teachers in the other room. This whole piece of information. If I told you, well, I think the subject is just the teachers, what would you say? You would say, in the other room is modifying the teachers. It's giving you information about the teachers, and therefore it cannot be left out of the subject of the sentence. So the teachers in the other room is going to be your subject. Therefore, you know that your predicate is going to be voted Mary president. And now you want to think about how you're going to divide up voted Mary president. Voted, we know, is the complete verb group. How do we know that? We know that because voted is the only verb in this sentence. Being the only verb in the sentence, it is the whole verb group. Because the whole verb group is main verb plus all of the auxiliary verbs. So here you have main verb and all the auxiliary verbs, which there are none. Then we have Mary president. Let's think about what's going on with Mary and president. Mary is the president, right? She has become the president through this action of voting. So in other words, president is not a different person from Mary. President is who Mary has become. So that shows us that president is actually a modifier of Mary and is therefore an object complement, because Mary, of course, is the direct object. She's the person who was voted to be, we could add this to be in there, to be president. So what are we going to have in terms of our structures? It's a direct object. We know automatically it must be a noun phrase. And the object complement can be what? It depends, because just like when you have a subject complement, you can have an adjective phrase, you can have a prepositional phrase, you can have a noun phrase. That's exactly the same thing when you have an object complement. It's something that is giving you information about a noun phrase, but it can vary in terms of its structure. So in this example, president is made up of what? Just a noun, therefore it's got to be just a noun phrase, and therefore the whole verb phrase is made up of the verb group plus the noun phrase plus the noun phrase. So this is what we call complex transitive. of a verb group plus a direct object plus an object complement. Let's take a look at another example where we have another object complement, but it's not a noun phrase. It's going to be a different type of phrase, but it's playing the same role semantically. That's the crucial thing here, is that what that phrase is doing in a sentence is basically the same regardless of the structure that it happens to take. So for example, if you say, the teachers in the other room consider the boss intelligent. So the teachers in the other room consider the boss intelligent. The teachers in the other room, subject of the sentence, and then looking at our predicate, consider is the only verb in the sentence. It therefore must be the verb group of the sentence. And what's occurring after it? The boss is receiving the action of considering, right? He's the, or she is the person being considered. So we say that it takes the action of considering and it is a noun phrase. Therefore, it's the direct object. And then think about what intelligent is doing. Intelligent is telling you about who? It's not telling you about the teachers in the other room. It's telling you about the boss. It's saying the teachers in the other room consider the boss to be intelligent. The boss to be intelligent. In other words, the boss has the property of being intelligent. So intelligent modifies the boss and is therefore an object complement. And when we think about what the phrase structure is going to be, well, consider is the verb group. The boss is the noun phrase. What about intelligent? We know that this is only comprised of an adjective. Therefore, it can't be a noun phrase. It has to be just an adjective phrase. So this is the structure that we would have for a sentence like that. And remember that we have one more possibility to a complex transitive because they are exactly like the intensive, except that you have something modifying the direct object as opposed to the subject. So we expect that we should be able to have examples where we have what? A prepositional phrase in that position, right? So when we say the teachers in the other room placed their votes into the box, the teachers in the other room is your subject. You're not going to worry about the internal structure of that for now. You're thinking more about what is the structure of the predicate of the sentence. So we know that the verb group is going to be placed because place is the only verb in the sentence. So that comprises your verb group, your first unit within the verb phrase. And then you have their votes. Their votes is receiving the action of the verb, right? It's the thing that is being placed. So therefore, it's the direct object, and it's made up of structurally a noun phrase. Then we have into the book. What is into the box? What is into the box telling you about? It's not telling you about the teachers. It's not telling you about the other room. It's telling you about their votes, right? Where do their votes end up? They end up being in the box. So into the box is modifying their votes and is therefore an object complement. And therefore we're going to have exactly the same structure that we have had for all the other complex transitives. Verb group, noun phrase, object complement. And in this case, obviously we don't have an adjective phrase, we have prepositional phrase. We have into, taking the noun phrase, the box as a complement. So we're going to have this type of structure. Okay, so what we've done is we've looked at the internal structure of different types of verb phrases. We have seen that we have many different verb phrase types and that their internal structure in terms of the tree diagram is going to be different depending on the type that you have. Every given type will always have the same structure. So any intransitive verb phrase is always made up of just a verb group with the main verb. That's it. There are no complements occurring within that verb phrase. Whenever you have a monotransitive verb phrase, what are you always going to have? Main verb, verb group, followed by direct object, which we know has to be a noun phrase. Ditransitive, indirect object and direct object. intensive, subject complement plus verb group. Prepositional, verb group plus prepositional phrase. Complex transitive, verb group plus direct object plus object complement. So, depending upon the type of verb phrase that you have, you will always have an identical verb phrase structure. And what you need to do is just figure out what are the types of phrases that we have within each type of structure. How do you know what you have? You have to look at the phrases that occur there. So when you have their votes, you know that there is a determiner. Votes is a noun. Necessarily, that's a noun phrase. Determiner and noun will always be a noun phrase. Into the box, aha, I have this preposition. It's telling me about location. So into the box is a prepositional phrase. Into the preposition followed by the box, which is a noun phrase. So if you have something like very fantastic, what's going on there? Very is describing fantastic. Fantastic is an adjective. It must be describing a nominal in a sentence. So that's going to be an adjective phrase. Okay, so those are the possibilities that you have for the verb phrase structures. I'm going to hand out, I'm not going to hand out to you, I'm going to send to you examples of many different sorts that you can practice, and that will help you to prepare for the assignment that you're going to hand in on Sunday, which is on the verb phrase structures. So what you want to do for that assignment is have exactly something like this. So place their votes into the box. You don't have to worry about the subject, just the predicate, the verb phrase, break it up into verb group plus all the complements, and then you're going to identify what type of verb phrase is that. Is it complex transitive, monotransitive, ditransitive, etc. Okay, so that's for what is going to be doing on Sunday. And the next thing that we are going to be talking about, but we won't start talking about it until Sunday, or I guess Monday morning actually, because it will be after 12:59. Monday is what is going on inside the verb group. So thus far we have said the verb group is made up of the main verb and the auxiliary verbs. So what is the relationship between the main verb and the auxiliary verbs? Do they occur in any particular order? Is there any structure to the verb group? And the answer, of course, is going to be yes. And we will see how that works when we come back. I will have the video up before Monday, but don't feel like you need to look at it before Monday. Okay? Let me know if there's any questions.